If you took Door Kickers to Task Force North and you gave it steroids and walked it outside and then added hundreds of assaulters to the friendly team and a similar number to the enemy team, and then you also gave those assaulters aircraft and tanks and artillery, and then you made the map 20 to 30 times larger than in Door Kickers 2, you would still be short what Combat Mission Shock Force has to offer. This game is a true military simulation. It is 100% designed to give a realistic maneuver experience, a ground warfare experience. And a lot of you guys have been encouraging me to check it out, and I finally did. It's a lot to handle, honestly. It's taken a lot to just figure out how to run it. And I'm interested to get feedback from you guys. I'm still trying to work out what this format will ultimately look like, but I did very much enjoy myself. I think there's an enormous opportunity here to talk about tactics and doctrine and some of the fire maneuver, the combined arms maneuver that we don't get to talk about on a larger scale in games like Door Kickers. So let's go ahead and get started. In this very first episode of Combat Mission Shock Force, I chose to do a quick battle to kind of learn the controls and start feeling my way around the sim on the whole. And what I decided to do was put myself as the U.S. Army. And this Shock Force game specifically is kind of set back in around 2007, 2008 era. And we're playing as the U.S. Army against a Syrian army, and it is based in Syria. We've selected to take a cavalry troop into battle. That troop is consisting of 3 separate subordinate platoon-size elements. We've also attached some enablers in the form of some 60mm mortars, as well as some special weapons like the javelin, as well as some mission command functions like the company headquarters. And on the map, we've got 3 pieces of hard cover stretched out across the whole thing. Our mission is to seize those pieces of hard cover and occupy them. That's how we'll win. And as you can see here, we rush straight to that first piece of key terrain and jump on it. We've got our forces arrayed just on the west side of this long danger area that bisects the entire map. You can see there the 3 victory points scattered across the map. And I've got my forces arrayed across that forward line of troops. My goal is to occupy both of those urban centers because I know those pieces of key terrain are going to give me a big advantage over the enemy once I can get up high on those buildings and look out far. You'll also notice here that we've gotten a contact, or we've taken contact from the enemy, and we have identified their location first to the east of that central village and then also up there to the northwest. As soon as we make contact, this is a cavalry squadron. And so we've got a bunch of fire support available to us, or we've got some guys that are really good at calling in fire support. And so as soon as we identify those enemy combatants, right away we call for fire. And I think I called for 120s first, so 120mm mortars. That's a battalion mortar tube. That's the biggest fire support asset I have available to me. And then I also called for some 60mm mortars that are organic to this squadron that I have on the ground. And those 60s begin impacting over here to the northwest while the 120s are working over there to the east. You can see we've made contact with what I think would be about a company-sized enemy element, all infantry, and this was all selected by the AI computer. And they're eager to get out of this corner of the map, and so they're pushing hard against me. But of course, we've already established a really solid base of fire, and they're not able to get across this big open danger area. And it's about this time we start to see the effects of that indirect fire that we requested begin to splash down. Sure enough, if you go and look at this deep urban center over here, this is that last victory point, that most northern one. We get good effects from our indirect fire on that spot, and we kind of disrupt the enemy and fix them in place there. Meanwhile, we're beginning to take those structures in the center of the map that I described as key terrain previously. In fact, we've got some fire support guys up there. We've also got our javelin operators up there, and we're still in contact with 2 enemy forces, one in the center of the map over to the east, and then still the other enemy further up to the northwest. Here you can see I'm moving more fire support folks into position, and that javelin that I put on top of that piece of key terrain is now using that javelin to engage the structure that is deep to the north. And the enemy that's up there to the north is also pinned down in the open. I've got the machine guns up on the roof, and they are having good effects on the enemy that is fixed up there in the open. You can see there they also had a recoilless rifle that looked like it was deployed in the field. So the enemy is getting some key weapon systems into the fight that could definitely present me with some problems later on. And while right now I've got the right terrain, I've got that piece of key terrain there in the center, I've also occupied the wood line there in the west. That's given me a huge advantage over the enemy. However, they've definitely got us outnumbered. And because I spent some of my currency points early on to purchase all these special weapon systems like this javelin that continues to go to work, the enemy seems to have invested most of their currency in purchasing units that are just they outnumber me significantly, and they seem willing to sacrifice those units by forcing this company-sized element here into the open and pressing against me, and that's going to prove difficult later on. Having seen the opportunity to move machine guns into more advantageous positions, you can see here I grabbed these gun teams. These are 3-man gun teams with a gun team leader, an ammo bearer, and a machine gunner carrying an M240 Bravo 7.62 medium machine gun. That's my most lethal direct fire weapon system that are on the battlefield. So I'm looking to get these guys into structures and get them up high so that they can reach out and touch the enemy more effectively from this key terrain in the center of the map. We've got both of those gun teams in position, and here, when we look at their sectors of fire, I'm now allowing that gun team that I put on that piece of key terrain to engage that entire northwestern portion. So the enemy that are pushing across that field are now going to be exposed to withering, grazing fire from this machine gun position on top of this structure. So now we've occupied the key terrain in the center. We're still in contact with a smaller enemy force over to the east, and it's time to start maneuvering against them. I've got them in a nice L because I've occupied that village in the center, and I've got an assault element moving now. So that village in the center can easily serve as my support by fire element, responsible for fixing the enemy in place with machine gun fire and then allowing this large infantry force to maneuver against it. And that's exactly what's happening. We're using that indirect fire that you hear impacting in the background to suppress the enemy and disrupt them from being able to maneuver. We're also using the machine guns in the center of the village to suppress the enemy over there to the east. And then we're finally maneuvering into position where we're able to assault. Here we're over on the west side of the map. That's the other enemy force that we're in contact with. These guys have been in and out of contact with the enemy. Right now they're just in the prone and holding. And back over here on the east side, I have these guys hunting for the enemy. They're now assaulting through that enemy force that was over on the east side. You can see tracers coming in from the west. That support by fire is working, and our guys are creeping up and getting kills as they do it. Now this is where things start to get a little bit dicey. I have 2 support by fire positions located in this center village. The problem is there is an IV line, an intervisibility line that prevents me from seeing over the road and truly into the field. And so this assault element here on the west is kind of at a disadvantage. And sure enough, they begin to take withering machine gun fire. The enemy has established a heavy machine gun nest just on the other side of that IV line on the west side of the map. And this assault element that I have in the west now appears to be at an enormous disadvantage and in a really high period of risk while they're stuck out here in the open. We've still got good effects from our indirect fire that are deep over there. Some of that's the 120mm mortars. Those are off map, and some of them are the organic 60mm mortars that are on the map. And now you can see I'm redirecting my direct fires from that center of the village onto a new enemy force. We've occupied another piece of forward terrain, of course. After we occupy this piece of terrain, as we start to creep forward, the enemy has essentially established what I would describe as a reverse slope defense. They've got at least 5 machine guns established at that final victory point way up to the north, and they are absolutely ripping us up. So it looks like we were going to get the advantage. Instead, we took a whole lot of fire. However, we did manage to get one final javelin off after we took all that machine gun fire and destroy that structure in the northern victory point. That should make it a little bit easier on my guys to occupy this final little hill mass and establish a final support by fire that'll get us all the way to the northernmost objective. The gun team on that little hill mass that is kind of key terrain to me is pinned down right now, but over to the west, I'm going to make another bold move and try to get these guys into the fight. Remember last time we pushed forward with this infantry element over to the west, they ended up taking a bunch of fire from the front, and the same thing happens here. And unfortunately, this time we end up taking a high amount of casualties. We did force some enemy to surrender in the process, but all in all, our guys did pay a dear price for the risk of moving across that open area. We still try to push more forces over to the eastern hill mass where previously we had been subjected to the enemy's reverse slope defense, and as we do, we begin to take some indirect fire from the enemy force, and then the enemy mounts an enormous counterattack, and you can see them push that hill mass. My guys barely hold them off, and then I counterattack into them, seizing the initiative and forcing them off of that hill mass, suppressing the enemy as best I can, and then pushing with a platoon plus size element, taking a few casualties in the process. but absolutely seizing the initiative, turning the table on the enemy, and maximizing violence of action to get across that open area and flip the stakes of the battle. You can see the enemy is so shocked. We even have some guys surrendering here. We did take some casualties. The enemy took a hell of a lot more. And they're absolutely in a full-on retreat, breaking contact back towards Victory Point there in the north. Now this puts us in a final L. We've essentially won the fight on the eastern side of the map. And the enemy is now retreating to the northwestern portion of the map at that final urban sprawl where I had destroyed the building and where my more western assault suffered all of those casualties. And as I continue to push forward on the west side, the situation continues to deteriorate. We already took some casualties here. We take even more. We maneuvered before we fixed the enemy. We maneuvered before we suppressed them. We didn't have effective fires into that forest area or into the northern Victory Point, and the cost was high. Having sustained all of those casualties on the western side of the map, as we moved north towards the final Victory Point, I knew that my final opportunity to seize the battlefield and win the day would be coming from the east. Having already won the skirmish on the eastern side, I continued pressing forward to establish what would become the final L of the fight. We were still in some contact, but we did manage to secure an assault position on the enemy's flank and begin effectively engaging the enemy with direct fire and with 40mm high explosive grenades. And then once we established in that assault position, we began suppressing the enemy with additional machine gun fire and trying to move more key weapon systems into position. That's exactly what you're seeing right here. So we're calling for fire deep into where we think the enemy is held up to the east and north of the final Victory Point, and in the hill mass and in the vegetation and in that restrictive terrain just north of that final Victory Point. From the assault position, we are able to put some effective direct fire on the enemy. We also can pause and take care of our wounded periodically. And then here we finally push forward to establish a final, what I would describe as an intermediate support by fire position. And we get at least 1-240 forward and in the fight to put suppressing fires on the final Victory Point, allowing us to maneuver closer to it. This 1-240 gets into the fight and he starts putting effects on the enemy over here. Unfortunately, shortly after establishing himself, he becomes suppressed, runs out of ammunition, and then earns himself a Distinguished Service Cross, taking out his little Beretta M9 and dumping a mag into the wood line, helping his buddies out with some 9mm suppressive fire. Somehow he survived this barrage, though. Anyway, he was able to achieve some suppressive effects with the 240 that allows us to press forward more with the final assault element on the eastern side of the map up towards the north. Still in contact the entire time, but creeping up until that last cover and conceal position, that last foothold before we ultimately are able to take the final Victory Point. The enemy still does have some machine guns established in the perimeter, and you can see the enemy is very well established in that wood line, but we finally get our troops just barely get a foothold in that wood line. And when we do, we're able to start putting effective fire on the enemy. We get some grenades out, we get some direct fire out, we get our 249s and our last 240 into the fight, and we start having good effects. The battlefield's absolutely littered with enemy dead. We've got a good support by fire establishing a foothold over there in the vegetation that allows us to put our final maneuver element into the Victory Point. Once we're in the Victory Point, we've now got a foothold in the southern, the central, and the northern Victory Points. That's everything we need to win the day. What you guys have seen over the last few minutes was about 2.5 hours of gameplay that I've kind of reduced down to just the good stuff. And I think I'm gonna, in the future, stop and talk a little bit more detail about some of the doctrine, but I wanted you guys to just get a feel for what this game has to offer and see if you enjoy this format or would recommend some changes to it. So by all means, please head down to the comment section and let me know what you guys thought. Thanks for watching. I'm Controlled Pairs. I play the most immersive combat sims and tactical shooters in the world. This is Combat Mission Shock Force. I'll see you in the next one.